Well, we'll just get started in a few seconds. Good morning. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for being here. We are very much looking forward to our discussion this morning. This program sort of continues the Chicago Council's work on global cities. As you all know, we did our inaugural Chicago Forum on Global Cities last May, and please save the dates for the second one on June 1st to the 3rd, 2016. Some of you might have gotten some communications about it already, but the invitations will be coming out in the next few weeks, so look out for that. Event is on the record. We are also live streaming, and we'll ask you to silence your phones, but do keep using social media and tweeting. All the handles and hashtags are on the sheets on your chairs. We have a few upcoming programs we'd like to invite you to. On December 4th, we'll be joined by John Meacham, who will talk about George H.W. Bush, An American Odyssey. On December 8th, we'll have a panel on Syria and the global refugee crisis with the U.S. Holocaust Museum. And on December 10th, we'll be joined by environmentalist Mama Aletta, who is returning from the COP21 talks in Paris. She'll talk about fighting climate change. And as I mentioned, save the dates for the Chicago Forum on Global Cities, June 1 to 3, 2016. I would now like to welcome Mr. Ken Boyce from UL. He is the Principal Engineering Manager for Energy Technologies, and UL is one of the sponsors of the Chicago Forum on Global Cities. So please welcome Mr. Ken Boyce.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Anna. Good morning, and welcome to the program. I'm thrilled to be here to represent UL at this important discussion, continuing the dialogue that had been started in May 2015 at the inaugural Chicago Forum on Global Cities. My company, UL, is actively involved in discussions and related research on evolving technology and its place in our world today and in the future. We see a greater need for building resilient power and building infrastructure. The Internet of Things will provide a great benefit to the cities of the future, and building design will evolve to meet the needs of a rapidly changing population. Our role at UL will be looking at how to advance technology in a way that doesn't compromise safety and security for all. I'm excited to hear more of the discussion today about the many minds in this room who are committed to the same concepts. I'm happy to briefly introduce this morning's panelists as well as the moderator. Their full bios are on your chairs. Please feel free to refer to those, but I'll run through some of the highlights quickly. Clive Christensen is Vice President of BP's Supply and Optimization for Fuels North America. Previously, he was the chief executive of BP's Integrated Supply and Trading Business of the Americas, responsible for BP's oil trading and supply activity. Sarah Herda is the artistic director of the Chicago Architecture Biennial and director of the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts. She was previously director at Storefront for Art and Architecture. Brian Lee is a design partner at Skidmore, Owing & Merrill, LLP. He has been responsible for several award-winning domestic and international projects, as well as first-place competitions. Andres Mendoza-Pina is principal in strategy, marketing, and sales practice with A.T. Kearney Incorporated, along with advising clients on issues including corporate strategy and merger integration. His work at A.T. Kearney includes the continued development of the Global Cities Index. Our moderator, Noah Tolley, is the director of the Center for Urban Engagement and associate professor of politics and international relations at Wheaton College. He also teaches on global cities at the Free University of Berlin's Center for Global Politics. His research and teaching interests include. Noah is also going to take up an official post at the Council in the near future as a senior fellow on global cities. Welcome all. I look forward to your discussion, and thank you.
Good morning and welcome again. I'm thrilled to be here to moderate this discussion. The topic framed by the title of the event is an important one. We know that cities now drive the world, but the question for today is, in part, what drives cities? Right? So as not to be circular in our discussion of global cities and the world, what is it that drives cities? What's behind that? And it's wonderful to have broad sectoral representation on the panel. I suspect it will be increasingly obvious over the next hour that we'll need that kind of breadth to begin to answer the question well. This is, as has already been said, an important part of the dialogue leading up to the second annual Chicago Forum on Global Cities, which will be June 1st through the 3rd, 2016, so please save the date. I want to kick it off with a foundational question that any of our panelists should feel free to answer, and I hope that many of them will. What does it mean to be a global city? And what are the essential characteristics of a global city? What is it that we're talking about when we say global city? Go ahead.
Happy to start a dialogue. So when we at A.T. Kearney thought about developing an index to measure how global cities were, we had to, first of all, align on a definition of what the global city is. And what we aligned on was to look at the ability of a city to attract, retain, and generate global flow of people, capital, and ideas. And the reason develop this definition is because we believe that at the core of connectedness with the world, and it's about this capability of attracting flows, retaining them, and generate to influence the world.
Mm-hmm. Good. Other panelists, what makes for a global city?
I mean, I think I might add to that, and retain, I think, gets added, but I would almost say sustain. That you have to, how do you attract talent? How do you create an environment where innovation and ideas can flourish and sustain the culture that supports that kind of environment?
Mm-hmm. Good. So if we're talking about the world and sustaining that sort of connection, I wonder what role architecture plays in that. And this question specifically for Brian and Sarah, what should we think about the role of architecture in creating an environment that has that kind of connectedness to the world, a certain groundedness, for sure, but also a certain connectedness to other places?
Sarah, you want to start?
Well, I would say in the context of the biennial, we really leveraged the architectural legacy of this city. So this is a city that has been a laboratory for over 100 years for innovation and ideas. And that has made Chicago essentially the canon, or a canon of modernism. So in a way, it doesn't matter where in the world you studied architecture, you know Chicago. And so that it is sort of ever present in the field and in the discourse and in the discipline. And I think when talking about today, it's about thinking also a long game, that architecture takes time. So the decisions that we make now, the decisions that we made 20 years ago, the decisions that we'll make tomorrow will affect the built legacy of a city like Chicago.
I think that as a designer, I've often wondered whether architecture really makes a difference in the city. You know, there's big issues out there, climate this week, there's crime, there's education, you know, big social issues, and there's certainly government policy issues that have a great bearing in terms of how our cities work. And so many times, I think, and Sarah knows this, architects, planners feel that they're really pushing things around, but not really having a big effect. But, you know, I'm also reminded, and I'm a transplant to Chicago, coming from the West Coast, of how great the tradition of architecture is here. And I think, for me, one of the things about Chicago as being a global city is that it always has had ambition. an ambition that started certainly fire, the Columbian Exposition, Century of Progress, recent administrations that really push a design and the environment as something that adds and contributes to the quality of life, but then attracts people, corporations, jobs, housing. And so I think that I was reminded of it because John King, actually a writer for the Chronicle in San Francisco, gave me a call last week, and he came out to see the biennial. They sent him all the way out here just to check it out. And he was surprised about not only the biennial, but also certainly the Lucas Museum, in terms of how did we snag that thing over San Francisco. And this quality of, and many people say that Chicago has that can-do attitude, the idea that you could actually gather people around, like-minded people, that would want to work on the city as a place that is a laboratory for our society. To me, is actually very interesting, and I think that is where architecture can add to it.
So that can-do attitude and ambition to make a difference locally, to make a difference even globally in some ways, is part of what attracts, retains, and sustains a certain talent level in the arts and architecture, let's say. Sarah, maybe you can tell us what more it takes to create opportunities for that talent in the city and to sustain their interest and involvement over time.
I mean, I think that there are many different attractors, also for talent, whether they be offices or schools. But one of the things I think that we're also very interested in the biennial being a launching pad for is a discussion and carving out space, carving out opportunities for architects and designers to be at the table where design decisions are being made, because design every day by all kinds of people, whether they be at the a political leader, a corporate leader, or a citizen. And so I think that having a broad discussion of design has the potential to create more opportunity. But I think that that's really where also, leaders in the community, I think that we need to dedicate a lot of energy and focus on creating opportunities for designers to design and to be at the table where design decisions are being made, because ultimately that is what will sustain and really have a vibrant design community. You have to have opportunities at all scales. So one of the things that one of the interesting things in the biennial, we have a focus on Chicago, ideas for Chicago. It's called Bold Alternative Scenarios for the City, and Brian participated in that. And we paired him with a young architect in Chicago, Grant Gibson. So, one of the largest and most esteemed firms in the city, and a very young and upcoming practitioner, and to also start that dialogue across generations and scales of work, which is something else that I think is important for a thriving architecture design community to sustain itself.
Now, maybe that's a great example from the biennial. Maybe there's another example that you can also give of something from the day-to-day operations in the city that would be an example of involving people in design early on who ought to be part of that conversation but are sometimes left out. Maybe, Brian, you have an example, or Sarah, you do? Involving people in design at the very beginning of the design conversation.
Yeah. Well, I have lots of examples where you get a room full of angry citizens commenting on a design, but that's part of the democratic process. I think that for me, one of the interesting things about building cities today, and I think it has to do with many things on the index, is that cities are built by aggregating great neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. And neighborhoods are, I believe, the kind of framework that allow you to think about the full range of housing types. I mean, people are talking pencil towers all the time now, but that represents a certain desirability. And you add single-family houses in there someplace. And how do you actually address that variety to create living environments that are providing those opportunities for the talent that the cities thrive on. You know, people that are in college, and we all know the success story of universities here in downtown, driving the economy and bringing life down to the city. When students get out of school, where do they go? When people get together and create small families, they make a decision to either stay in the city or they leave. And how do you keep them in the city? Because we know that the idea of density, creating a walkable, compact environment that then has the ability to deal with transportation in a very easy way. It deals with all the cultural amenities, deals with educational opportunities. I think that you can see that the build effect of if you build strong neighborhoods, maybe you can address issues about safety. Maybe you can address issues about the environment. MCP gave an award this year, and one of the things that we were lucky to see is that there are many different initiatives coming out of the neighborhoods that are initiatives that aren't driven by administration. Many of them are actually private enterprise. The 606 was funded by a private enterprise. Oak Park and forgetting the neighborhood right next to Oak Park. Forest Park, I think they both got together and thought about how they could measure the amount of energy and waste in the neighborhood. Those are kind of big ideas that are coming out of the way people live. And so I think that this idea of how can you actually build strength in all the neighborhoods, north, south, west, to create a great city is something that all people can band together. And I don't diminish also the idea that corporations actually have a large part in that. When corporations live in the city, they become more active. BP is a great sort of example of people being in the city and actually driving many of the kind of great experiences of this place.
But I have a question for Clive, transitioning off of that exactly, which is that these different, the arts, education, environment, these different features of neighborhoods that Brian was just speaking to, they must play some role in attracting and sustaining the sort of talent that play.
I think they play a number of roles. I think a lot of it was the flavor that Brian was talking about, diversity. And so the big attraction for us in being part of a global city is the talent pool that everyone's referred to. I think I look at the city, again, I've only been here two and a bit years, and the city has a tremendous legacy, I think, around its green spaces, its education, the universities, and the museums. And that attracts people to come back into the city and live in the city, which then creates a talent pool that we can touch into and hopefully attract. So that's a big element to think about being in the city, and I think the architecture, the diversity of the city is a big component about why you want to be in a place like Chicago or in any global city, and you need that, I think, to compete on the global stage. That then attracts investment, innovation, education, and all those are key elements to sustain a global city, as the survey says, but also to ensure you attract the right diversity of business here to encourage future investment and diversity and talent to be in the organization. I think there's a big community piece to it as well. Obviously we, like any local corporation, you have a role in community, not just what you bring kind of corporately to the city in recruitment and taxes and all that kind of stuff. But a big piece of it as well is wanting, for your employees, wanting to be part of that community. And we all have a role, I think, to give something back. And so that ranges from big corporate investments into the infrastructure of the city, right through to people's time in the community, whether it's supporting education, helping schools, helping children see what life is like in the city, or to work in a corporation to encourage their futures. And then they get to experience what it's like to be in a business or in a big place like Chicago. So I think it's a big role that we have to play around the community, let alone what we do kind of commercially for the shareholder.
So you're saying it's not a one-way street. It's not just that the features of our neighborhoods and our cities attract talent for our corporations, but our corporations give back. And what role, Andres, have corporations played, the presence and maybe disproportionate presence or network of global corporations played in our way of thinking about global cities, or A.T. Kearney's way of thinking about global cities?
Well, they do play a role, a very important one. And actually, when we look at the different factors in which we measure global cities, we consider 5 dimensions. And one of those dimensions is what we call business activity, and the presence of global corporations is one of the key metrics that we look into. But beyond just the business aspect of the city, we look at 4 other characteristics that somehow relate to what we have been discussing. We look at human capital, that talks about the talent, universities. We look at information exchange, the ability and the capability of the inhabitants to exchange ideas and information around the world. Cultural experience, a very important element to attract a diverse pool of people, and political engagement. So these are the 5 dimensions that we consider when we look at the current status, global status of the cities. And however, based on our analysis, business activity and human capital are the 2 factors that weigh the most to determine the global standing of cities.
So in the Carney rankings and in most global city rankings, what is being measured is the role of that city as a site or a place. Right? What are the features of that site? What are the features of that place? But talk a bit about the role of cities as actors. Is there any way in which we ought to be considering cities as actors on the global stage, either in the way that they manage the local environment as a place where businesses can make a difference and can sustain themselves, or in which they reach out onto the global stage and participate, for example, in climate governance or security governance? Should we be thinking of cities as actors too?
Well, that's an interesting point. At the end of the day, there is a question, why bother to be a global city, right? It's not just a place, but so what is the benefit of becoming a global city and being proactive in achieving that status? And the way we think about it is that a global city is a very vibrant place that would attract talent, and that talent is going to drive innovation, drive growth. And once you have growth, that's going to keep attracting talent, and you have a virtuous cycle that push the city forward. So, and if we think about the future in which cities are going to play an even kind of increasing relevant role, right? I think it was a few years ago in 2010 in which there was a milestone, more people living in cities than in rural areas. And if we look at the evolution of the human kind of race and the economy from rural economy, industrial economy, digital economy, the role that cities are going to play is going to be even more relevant. So this quest to become global, to drive growth, attract talent and innovation is going to become critical for survival of the cities. So I think that it's very important to think about an actor and being proactive to have this global status.
I think cities are natural, right? They're all driving the same talent and business. But I also think that it's an interesting phenomenon where cities learn from each other. And so they look for best practices. They try to understand how to ease transportation, how to deal with the environment, waste systems, water systems. And we find that in our international work, where we get a lot of people looking internationally and even domestically about lessons that they can learn from each other.
I mean, I was just going to add, I think the role of, there has to be this relationship between government and cities, obviously. But I actually think the cities, partly where Brian was going with the competitive element, have almost now playing a more important role than government at times, trying to drive, because they have to be competitive, so you have to get the right talent, the innovation, the investment, and so they do learn from one another, but that forms alliances as well, and certainly in my travels, you definitely see the major cities trying to link up much more, share their understanding, talk about the issues cities facing and taking action. And I also often see that active and more efficient at times than a national level. And so, I think this role of acting is very, very important, not just because they're competing with one another, but that competition drives cooperation, drives learning, and that drives a degree of responsibility, which I think then brings bigger debate to whether it's climate, social issues, design, how do we foster talent, how do we foster inward investment, innovation, where's the next big idea coming from? All these things, I think major cities are thinking about all the time, proactively trying to do that within the city, but also whether there's globally. You can see that in Chicago. I think the mayor here has done a lot of work with China and Shanghai and Beijing, for example, trying to bring that best practice, not just advertising Chicago, but there's a whole remit behind that, which I think is key. And often I see that more progressive at times.
About Chicago is that, you think about the East Coast in terms of the connected cities. And you think about the West Coast in terms of how it actually has a thriving economy and a certain spirit and ability to work together. And then you think about Chicago in terms of, at first, its isolation, 500 miles before you get to another city. And yet, if you think about the Great Lakes, in terms of the cities around the Great Lake in this Midwest district, there's 28, 30 million people that are potentially connected. And so you wonder whether or not cities in this learning from each other, potentially working together, could actually build a network that rivals the East Coast in terms of comparable populations, certainly natural resources, and maybe a kind of new spirit of going beyond boundaries of their own city limits.
Good.
I would just add that this role of, playing the actor, the biennial is very much, it is the actor, it's convening the world. But the biennial is not only a celebration of Chicago architecture, it's really about creating a new global platform to discuss the present and future of architecture and really bringing the world here to do that, to exchange, to learn from each other, and to really expand this kind of network of ideas. And now that we've established this platform, it's really what do we do? That you work to establish the platform, and then what do you do with the platform? And I think that that's, again, a crucial step in sort of sustaining a vital dialogue and this opportunity for innovation.
Good. So a couple times we've talked about cities learning from each other, sort of the horizontal networking that cities can do. There's a vertical networking where cities might actually propose a policy that works really well on the ground and states might adopt it, let's say. But there's also this horizontal networking where one city might do something, another city learns from it and best practices. And energy and environment have come up a couple times in our conversation already. I wonder if we can mention a few specific examples of technologies or designs that are making a difference or poised to make a difference in cities regarding energy and environment.
Look at me with the energy company. I mean, I think there's a few I've come across. One actually, before I lived here, I lived in Singapore. And Singapore had a big focus on water efficiency. It's a small city-state. Most of its water historically actually came from Malaysia through pipeline or through vessels, actually. And so they, over their history, have built a lot of infrastructure around trying to retain water. I think my understanding they're at the forefront now of osmosis technology that allows you to cleanse and purify water so it's drinking grade. And that science technology actually came from a lot of their inward investment, but they spent a lot of time working with the Middle East and the West Coast of the US, trying to understand their technology, adopt that, and then build research centers within Singapore that has led it to be at the forefront of osmosis. And now they're advocating that technology onto other cities where we have water issues in other countries. So that's definitely one that I've seen in operation. Another big one I think around energy efficiency is really actually at the heart of the city and what we do every day, day in out around how we use energy. So this might seem a bit bizarre from an energy company that says, drive more miles, but the opposite is, around how well we use power at home. And if you look at a lot of the investment now and innovation around energy, it's around smart grid technology, the use of apps, the use of high-technologized IT at home to control when your power sources are on and off, and actually try and create small generation within the city rather than these big, large, complex generators outside cities. And again, that is a global activity that I've seen definitely in London here, New York, Singapore and Asia, where people are trying to bring and learn from one another, because it's a big issue. So obviously it contributes to the environment and what's happening to the atmosphere, the whole climate change debate. So I see a lot of city work going into, because of this piece of population moving in more and more into cities, you have to solve it at the city level rather than at the national level. Mm. So there's a lot of innovation we see going into technology around power use and home efficiency, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Brian or Sarah, anything you'd like to add from the world of architecture?
I mean, I think that we're seeing also, and you see examples in the biennial of both efficiency of space, like how much space do we actually need, that even a luxurious space could be a 2,000 or a 1,700 square foot footprint instead of a 4,000 or a 6,000 square foot, house. There's a lot of rethinking the way in which we live at that very basic level. And then I think that issues of energy and run through a lot of the projects that people are working on. But I would also say that there's a kind of overwhelming commitment to social issues within architecture, and so a kind of deploying architecture to create dignified spaces, that everyone deserves architecture. Everyone, in fact, deserves a kind of luxury that good architecture provides. Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's another element that, that the role of design is not only about function, utility, and efficiency, but it's also about the quality of space and how that contributes to better daily life. Architecture affects every aspect of our daily lives, where we live, work, go to school, and so thinking about, I think, also the quality of those spaces.
Mm-hmm. So I want to bring it home to Chicago at this point. That doesn't mean we're closing up. I have a closing question, but I do want to bring it home to Chicago. And I'd like to know whether you think Chicago is a global city. And if it is, why? And in some ways, we know this answer from rankings, right? Chicago does appear on the A.T. Kearney rankings. But in some ways, Chicago has in the past struggled to see itself as a global city. And so I wonder if we can speak to perhaps why that struggle is Chicago a global city, and if so, why? We can start with Andres.
I have a fact-based opinion on this question. Because of the study that I have been involved with for almost 7 years. The obvious answer to the question is yes. And Chicago not only ranks very well in the index, right now is the 7th position out of 125 cities that we track. It has always been in the top 10. But what is interesting to know is that we are also developing a companion perspective to the index, which is the outlook, which looks into the future, analyzing certain elements that will enable cities to attract and generate those flows that we talk about. And there are 16 cities around the globe that rank in the top 25 in both the index, which looks at current performance, and the outlook that looks at the future. Mm-hmm. And Chicago is one of those 16 cities. Mm. So it is very hard for me to remove my opinion from the facts and tell you that I truly believe that Chicago is a global city. I've been in the city for 10 years, and I've been traveling around the world because of my work, and I don't see anything that Chicago can be lacking in comparison to one of the top cities that people think of, leaving aside perhaps weather, which is completely out of control. But quite honestly, Chicago has a very strong foundation. The business activity is a hub for finance. Several large corporations are based here. When you think about the human capital that Chicago has, this is actually one of the areas where Chicago spikes in the index. if you think about the diverse population, the quality of the universities that Chicago has. Not only Chicago is well positioned, but particularly is thinking about the future. I think it's a very bright future for Chicago, particularly because of the emphasis on innovation. If you think about the work that 1871, the startup incubator is doing, supported by the city, we believe that innovation is going to play a very important role in the future of cities. And Chicago is placing the emphasis in that area, is placing the right bets. So just to sum it up, we not only believe that Chicago is a global city, but is placing the right bets to ensure that in the future we'll continue being a very important city in the globe.
I think it's fascinating that Chicago is one of 16 cities that appears both on the index and in the outlook. And I want to come back to the outlook in a few minutes, but I wonder if there are any other fact-based opinions or opinion-based opinions on whether Chicago is a global city and why. What's distinctive about it?
Well, no offense to the Global Index, there's lots of surveys all the time that talk about quality of life, livability, where does Chicago exist in these places. And to me, I step back from those things and often put it in personal terms. If you had to go someplace to live, to work, what city would you choose? And I think Chicago oftentimes maybe is not the obvious choice from the first instance, but when you start to evaluate the livability, the quality of life, the accessibility to great cultural amenities, the diversity of housing opportunities, diversity, those things actually start to create a very interesting picture of what Chicago is. And Chicago, I think, but getting back to that ambition, it does have thinkers that really do want to have a say in terms of how our society is going to move forward. So when you ask the question about the energy and environment, I was thinking that's a hard question because it's so broad. But if you would take a broad aspect of it, Chicago's been very actively involved, and many of the firms here, design firms here, and the city have been involved in the environment in China. There was a China Accord that was signed that said that China was, and the work that we do over there, is going to reduce its emissions and waste and of water and production of waste by significant levels. And at first we thought, is this just symbolic? But then it actually caused many local design institutes to also sign up, as well as government agencies. So the idea is significant as being an actor on the world stage. And then I'll finish up with a small example that I discovered, is that we were lucky to do a small library in the city of Chicago. And the small library is part of a branch of a larger library system that we then found out is the #1 library system in the United States, Chicago Public Libraries. And it's #3 in the world. And here is a condition wherein people have kind of wrung their hands and said, well, what's the role of libraries today in society? Here's a city, an institution that really says a library is a place of learning. And if it could actually be a center and a hub for a neighborhood, what better way actually to make an effect on how people live and the quality of life of its citizens? And so that idea of the big to small, oftentimes I think cities succeed in many small, incremental successes. And I think that's where I think Chicago is right now.
Good.
I'll just add, I think both very comprehensive answers, and I think the survey helps us from a commercial perspective, and my answers will be very similar. I do think the city is a global city, and that's one of the reasons we are here and have been here for a long time. It has the human capital piece, which is critical, the diversity of talents, the great education. It's a livable city. People want to be here for all the reasons we talked earlier with the lake, the park, the architecture, and it creates a place to be, which I think is very, very important for an employee as much as it is for a corporate thinking about where it wants to be based. I think the kind of commercial investment that's in the city and the scale that brings to the city is also an important factor. as with connectivity. We talked a lot about connectivity within the city. You know, IT infrastructure for my business is critical, and there's only so many places in the world you can build a big trading organization because you need to have the IT here and the infrastructure here to support that, and that's going to be to talk to the world in milliseconds. And Chicago has that. It's got O'Hare, it's got the rail transport, so it is a hub from a transport perspective, which if you do, you know, and I think the other element obviously is the fiscal environment here is also, from a very commercial perspective, supportive. So there's a number of factors I think that are here for the city. I do think innovation is critical for the future, and I think you're going to talk about that in a minute. And so you can't sit back. I think the city has to keep pushing, keep being competitive, because index said, you know, there's 41 new cities in the index or something like that since the last survey. So, you know, that dynamic is very real, and there are many cities in the world trying to emulate other big, powerful global cities, and they're always out to offer. So I think how do you maintain that top 10 ranking? How do you stay at the forefront? It is critical. And I think a little bit I can relate to Brian's personal piece. When you talk to people globally, you know, where's a major global city? I don't think Chicago comes off the first, would be named initially. You know, London, New York, Berlin, Frankfurt, whatever. So there's still something more for the city, I think, around branding itself, and you know, things like the biennial. Some of the sporting events they hold here are important, but branding, I think, is another key element to how, to make sure people can see you on the global stage as a place to be and want to live.
I want to ask one last question before we turn to audience questions, and this connects with the outlook, Andres. I wonder if our panelists would share with us one city that may not currently be on our radar screen. Maybe it's on the outlook list, it could be, but not one of the 16, because it shouldn't be on the index list, right?
Okay.
One city that's not currently on our radar screen that is an emerging global city that we should pay attention to, something that architects are noticing, something that you're noticing at A.T. Kearney. Anyone can start. Go ahead.
Happy to start. And I'm going to start cheating because the first city I'm going to mention is in the index as well, and is one of the top 16. But it's interesting because it's a city that people in the country where the city is from would look at that city down and would be surprised about it. At least a few years ago, and it's Berlin. It's an extremely vibrant city. There is a very strong startup dynamic and culture, very young in terms of the culture, the people, and over time has been improving and giving all these emphasis on innovation, startups. I see Berlin continue rising in the future. Then I can give you a regional perspective. In Latin America, Santiago in Chile is the city that ranks the highest in the outlook, and Chile has always had a very tidy economy and is a very well-run country, and Santiago is reaping the benefits of that environment. In China, Beijing is the city that's better positioned in the outlook, and it's interesting because Beijing has both, has all the business powerhouse of the state-owned enterprises, plus the political capital of the local authorities. So has two strong assets to continue improving in the future. And then in Africa, Johannesburg is the city that ranks the highest in the outlook.
Great.
Just from the experience of the biennial, which we have over 120 people from over 30 countries, some of the cities where we really saw a lot of interesting activity were places like Medellin, Colombia, Cape Town, Johannesburg, Ho Chi Minh City, Hanoi, Bangkok. So I think that we were also looking for work happening in more sort of developing kind of economies and outside of the sort of Western canon of architecture. But I think that there is a lot happening through Africa, Southeast Asia, that was incredibly exciting.
Well, I had a few. I'd say in South America, Panama is another one. I think Panama is trying to emulate Singapore and Dubai in many different aspects. KL, so Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, again, very competitive. Baku, so it's another interesting one growing. I mean, it's the heart of energy, but it's been a lot of investment in education and technology. And then, I don't know, China, there's so many, or India, there's so many. I don't know where to start there. Probably Guangzhou, I'll counter, because again, in the south, it's a major hub, 25 million people, and really transforming from an industry-based economy to technology and arts and investment. So, great, there's a few.
That's terrific. All right, I think we have time for audience questions. And I'll start with this one right up front. Sorry, microphones were further away from this one, but I'm sure they can converge.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. My name is Fabian Elliott, here on behalf of Google and Black Tech Mecca. Had a question around the branding piece, as far as how does Chicago go about rebranding itself as a global city, especially with some of the negative perceptions, such as Spike Lee's new movie, Chirac, and some of these other challenges that we're facing. So what would be some practical steps that we could take as a city to start rebranding ourselves as a global powerhouse?
I would just take this from the world in which I operate. I think that maybe this is a little counterintuitive, but I almost think it's a sort of one-to-one. It's maybe, from my perspective, some of the things in the last 10 years that I've been here really invested in getting people here, getting people, that people are not just, one, that they don't fly over, that they stop, and when they stop, that they get introduced to all of the cultural assets that we have in this city, which aggregates down to the people that have the ideas and produce the ideas, because I think that true connection to what's happening here is what will also sustain and make it possible for people with ideas to be here. Because to be here and not leave, your work, I believe, has to be known elsewhere. So it's about creating these networks, and I think that there is a bigger role for branding exercises, but I also think that it happens really at the level of individually bringing the people, people through Chicago that need to be here, and making sure that they the wide breadth of things that are happening here in all sort of spheres. And I think as I see that as one of the real priorities in my role as both the director of the Grant Foundation and at the Biennial, is that it's about bringing people here and really making that network tangible.
That's a fascinating answer, because we often think of branding as an abstraction, right? It's how we're going to represent the city, maybe synectically, somewhere else, to people who may never show up. But you're emphasizing the role of people actually being here and having concrete experiences in Chicago, on the ground, building networks here, and meeting people here, which is very different from how we normally think of branding. Good. Anybody else have an answer on that?
I think it's a great response. I think the other piece is proactivity, so actions are louder than words, just building off your theme. I mean, I think, and Chicago is trying to do this. One of the great things I've noticed about being here, the city is, the city does a tremendous job connecting the community about promoting Chicago within Chicago and trying to bring people into the city. I just think trying to do that a little bit more on the global stage and talking about and being part of the global debates, whether it's on social, macroeconomic, technology, the connectivity and the scale of the city. I think these are all themes that I think are really, really important. And where it's trying to go in the future, and I think being part of that debate and tangibly talking about what it's doing is a great advert for the city, because everything's here.
Good. Another audience question, maybe right here. Sorry, Brian, I didn't know you had.
Because I think that's a significant question. In terms of, you think about Chicago, what are the positives and negatives, and that scale, is tipped in terms of public perception about what Chicago is. I think that, we need to push private and public interests to invest in our neighborhoods. We need to deal with issues of crime and education and jobs. We need to provide investment to support small businesses. Deregulation got rid of a lot of the banks, community banks. We need to provide right kind of housing. There's people that are doing housing in the neighborhoods that are trying to build those areas, but it's not enough. Schools are trying to do it. I know U of C is very interested in how to build that community around its campus, but they're not the only ones that can do it. Obama Library will help in a certain sense, but that's probably one of the most pressing issues for the city of Chicago in terms of how do you address the social issue. And for architects, it's very difficult because, again, sometimes we just think we're pushing things around. But if designers, innovators, business leaders, people who actually write policy can get behind an idea that this is the problem, the most important problem in front of us now, I think it could be solved, or at least progress could be made.
That's another good point. One of the foremost urban historians and sociologists of the 20th century and early 21st, Janet Abu-Lughod, actually argues that Chicago must deal with these social tensions if it is going to succeed as a global city. Very good. Up here.
Just a comment, you were asking about ways in which cities are collaborating, and several of us in Chicago put together a group of 124 sustainability officers from the US and Canada that now meet annually. And in addition, there are regular web conversations between the cities with people around garbage, transportation, et cetera. So there's been a lot of learning both from best practices and also mistakes. And I'd be interested in, this is really a good example where collaboration has helped, if all of you have other ideas where cities are doing a better job of working together and to an extent collaborating. Assuming you have a mayor who really likes to collaborate.
Good. Any other ideas about where cities can collaborate? This was an example of a sustainability directors network that actually crosses international boundaries between the US and Canada. And we often talk about sustainability in cities, but are there other areas where cities can collaborate and get some mileage out of that? Andres, go
I
ahead.
just can think of one, and I think you can see a theme here around innovation in my speech here, but the way in which cities are tapping into technology to reach and engage, I think is an area in which there could be significant cross-learnings across cities. And I think it's a space that we are just scratching the surface. I think that when you look at the corporate world and how technology is making an impact in how companies kind of operate, not only kind of reaching to their consumers, but also internally. And if we think about how we as citizens are kind of leveraging technology to interact with our local governments, I think there's a significant gap. So I expect that can be a space in which we can see some operations and learnings across different cities.
We have time for one more audience question right here. I didn't go to this side of the room before.
Hi, Scott Bernstein, Center for Neighborhood Technology. So much as was just pointed out that Chicago came together around climate change and sustainability. I wonder if we can imagine, perhaps from the Kearney study, which of these cities are doing the best job of addressing inequality. I noticed buried in the back of your report, Prague was the top performer on the Gini index of inequality, but you didn't say how everybody else did. So I don't think any of your top performing global cities did well on inequality. And I don't think this is a secondary sort of issue, either in the United States or the world today. Poverty is increasing. We tend to talk about the growth of the economy in gross terms, not net, of the loss in the bottom. And finally, you pointed out nobody came here because of the weather. I mean, nobody came here directly because of the innovation. The myth of Chicago for a long time was there was a job for everybody who wanted a good job, and that's not true anymore. So which cities are actually taking on poverty? And can we imagine the kind of intercity collaboration that Adele mentioned on sustainability around effective strategy?
I think we have time for only one or two quick answers to that. And it's a really great question, Scott, but it was the last one, sorry.
So yeah, I was just Yes, it's a very important question. And I think that it's not an easy answer. I think cities try to balance how to drive growth, which is important, at the same time maintaining equality in the population. And it's not an easy kind of balance to find. As you pointed out, many of the top performing cities still have a good degree of inequality in the population. So it's a city by city task to find that balance. And we can perhaps follow up offline, but it's a very important element, and it's not an easy one to get right.
I mean, I would just quickly add that I also think that it's a kind of individual responsibility that within our different fields. I mean, so maybe from architecture, I mean, I think that something that we found in our search for practices around the world were people, in fact, addressing these issues of inequality from the place that they're working. And so, you know, these cities like Medellin or Mexico City, Ho Chi Minh City, where people were really also, the projects that we're showing where they are addressing inequality, or even the project, one of the projects that we're featuring from China, Rural Urban Framework, it's work that's looking at rural China, which whenever you think of China, you probably think of you might think of an SOM building or a large building in a new central business district, but a fine grain of what does a small school look like in China, what does a small house look like in the Mekong Delta, what is an affordable house in Mexico. I mean, I think that it's also an individual responsibility in our fields to address inequality because it exists in the cultural sphere, it exists in the corporate sphere, in the public sphere, et cetera. And I think it's a responsibility that everyone has to address.
Well, that's a great way to end. Thank you all for coming this morning. That's all the time that we have, but please join me in thanking our panelists. And we are adjourned.